The last shells had fallen on Saipan in the summer of 1944, and the air still hung thick with the smell of smoke and blood. Entire platoons had vanished in suicidal charges, leaving only a few hundred weary men, hollow-eyed and trembling, to face the Americans surrounding them. Private Shigaru Nakahara, only 19 when he left Okinawa, stood barefoot, clutching a broken rifle that no longer fired. The enemy, the barbaric Americans, was supposed to be a monster wearing human face, but what approached was calm, steady, almost normal. No jeers, no cruelty, only orders in a language he barely understood. The first act of mercy came in the form of water, bread, and cigarettes. Some prisoners refused, certain it was a trick. Others reached out with shaking hands, unable to resist. Nakahara's first sip of clean water burned down his throat, and tears came unbidden. Nearby, an interpreter shouted in Japanese, "You will not be harmed if you cooperate." The prisoners exchanged uneasy glances. It made no sense. Stories and propaganda had painted Americans as torturers and monsters. Yet here they were, offering medical care and sustenance instead of death. As more captives arrived from Guam and Tinian, the camp swelled with haunted faces, half-starved and half-shamed. Lieutenant Kenji Takahashi tried to maintain order among his men, whispering, "Remember, they will photograph us. Stand straight. We are soldiers of the Emperor." Yet when an American guard handed him a cigarette with a faint smile, he did not know how to respond. Some prisoners attempted suicide, refused food, or resisted the unfamiliar kindness. The Americans, following the Geneva Convention, provided clean water, medical attention, and rest, a concept foreign to most Japanese soldiers. Nakahara wrote in his diary on scraps of paper hidden in his uniform, "I am still alive. I do not understand why the Americans treat us as men, not beasts. I feel both shame and gratitude. I wish I could forget the Emperor's voice in my head." That night, the camp was quiet except for distant trucks. Their pride was torn in half, their world upended, and yet the strangest part of their journey had only just begun. Across the Pacific, ships waited, ready to carry them into a world they could never have imagined. The morning the prisoners were herded toward the docks. The air was thick with sea salt and dread. Shadows of Japanese soldiers, thin and hollow from weeks of hunger, shuffled down the ramps toward a gray, weathered transport ship flying the American flag. U.S. Marines stood quietly, rifles slung but hands relaxed, their calm presence a stark contrast to the chaos the prisoners had expected. For many, this was the first time they had stood so close to an American vessel, and it felt unreal, like stepping into another world. America had been a myth of arrogance and power, yet here it was orderly, precise, almost surreal in its calm. Private Nakahara's hands were bound loosely as he stepped aboard, his boots trembling against the vibrating deck beneath him. The mechanical hum of the engines was alien, unstoppable, a strange comfort and terror all at once. Below deck, the prisoners were corralled into narrow compartments with steel partitions separating them from the crew. Buckets served as toilets, stacked mattresses lined the walls, and the pungent smell of fuel clung to the air. Meals were served twice daily, small portions of rice and a strange brown stew called beef hash. The soldiers eyed it cautiously, unsure if it was edible. Corporal Stevens, a young guard from Iowa, watched them with wary curiosity. He had seen enough death in the Pacific to last a lifetime, yet now he stood over men who a month earlier might have killed him. "They don't look like monsters," he muttered to his partner. "Just tired men." The first storm hit on the second day, tossing the ship violently. Below deck, some prisoners vomited from the rocking, while the guards handed out saltine crackers and paper towels. Speaking in slow, clear English, they offered gestures the prisoners could barely understand, but it mattered. For the first time, Nakahara looked up at his captors not with hatred, but with confusion. By the fourth day, the Americans allowed small groups on deck for fresh air. The Pacific stretched endlessly around them, a deceptive calm. Nakahara clutched the cold railing, staring at the horizon as thoughts of home flickered in his mind. the sound of cicadas, his mother's kitchen, streets of Okinawa he might never see again. Lieutenant Takahashi watched nearby, murmuring to a fellow prisoner, "They let us breathe, eat, even stand in the sun, and they do not curse us." His companion, too weak to respond, simply stared at the sky, unable to reconcile this care with the propaganda drilled into their minds. Medical inspections continued with quiet precision. Tropical ulcers, malnutrition, and malaria were treated without scorn. The guards offered aspirin, cleaned wounds, even shared cigarettes off duty. Each act of mercy defied everything the soldiers had been taught, that surrender was dishonor, that mercy was weakness. Rumors spread below deck. Some feared execution, others whispered of secret experiments. But the reality was far quieter. The men were being transported to a network of POW camps across the United States, a strange land where survival might coexist with unexpected kindness. Nakahara began to hear laughter from above deck. The voices of American sailors sharing stories, joking about wives and mothers, singing songs that echoed through the metal walls. For the first time in months, life seemed possible, even in the shadow of captivity. The coastline of California slowly emerged, green hills and tidy towns untouched by war, a stark contrast to the devastation they had left behind. The prisoners whispered among themselves, incredulous that the land of their enemies could be real, orderly, and alive. When the prisoners finally disembarked at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, the sun glinted harshly off the orderly barracks and stretches of barbed wire. The air, crisp with autumn chill, wrapped around the men like a foreign cloak. Private Nakahara squinted against the sunlight, gripping his new identification tag, POW 219, as if it both defined and erased him. Lieutenant Takahashi, tall and stiff, tried to maintain the posture of a soldier, yet the weight of defeat pressed heavily on his shoulders. For months they had lived in caves and tunnels, hunted by death at every turn. Yet here the enemy offered no cruelty, only strict rules and cold efficiency. The guards, rifles slung but hands relaxed, guided them through search and registration. They were stripped of their tattered uniforms and handed ill-fitting khaki clothes marked POW, a tangible symbol of transformation. Nakahara's old uniform, the tattered remains of his identity, was tossed into a pile. He wanted to protest, to cling to something familiar, but his throat caught. When an American handed him a neatly folded wool blanket, he whispered a small "thank you" in broken English. The guard nodded and moved on. Lieutenant Takahashi, rigid as ever, was examined by a medical officer who asked if he had any injuries. "A soldier does not complain," he replied. The interpreter related, and the doctor offered only a faint, weary smile. "You are not a soldier right now," he said softly. "You are a man who needs rest." The barracks were long wooden buildings, each equipped with thin mattresses and wool blankets. Compared to months of starvation and combat in the Pacific, it was almost luxurious. Yet the silence was heavy with shame. They had been raised to die for the emperor, not to sleep under the roof of the enemy. Hunger gnawed, but fear and pride weighed heavier. That evening, a bell echoed across the camp. Guards called out for roll, names and numbers reverberating through the chilled air. The prisoners followed the scent. A strange warmth carried through the barracks. It was food. In the mess hall, long tables gleamed under buzzing fluorescent lights. American cooks ladled generous portions of thick beef stew, potatoes, white bread with butter, and bowls of fruit cocktail. Nakahara froze at the sight. Real meat. Real fruit. He had eaten roots, insects, and scraps of muddy rice for months. Hands trembling, he held out his tray. The cook, a broad-shouldered man from Kansas, smiled faintly and said, "Eat up." Hesitant at first, the prisoners took their seats. The first bite was cautious, the second more assured. A wave of flavor, simple and salty, hit them like a shock. One man cried quietly. Another whispered, "They feed us like men." Lieutenant Takahashi stared at the stew, thick with carrots and beef chunks. The aroma reminded him faintly of home, yet richer and heavier. Confusion rose within him. The Americans, whom he'd been taught were savages, were showing mercy. Nakahara wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, eyes burning. The stew nourished more than the stomach. It filled an emptiness he had not realized. Around him, prisoners ate silently, some with tears running freely, their pride and beliefs colliding with the reality of compassion. After the meal, an interpreter addressed the hall. "You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. You will not be harmed if you follow the rules. You will work, you will eat, and you will live." The words struck Nakahara like thunder. They would live. After months of expecting death at every turn, they would live, and the enemy who had once been a monster was showing humanity. That night, the barracks were quiet, except for the rustle of blankets and the soft hum of the wind outside. Takahashi lay awake, whispering into the dark why. A quiet voice answered from the bunk below. It was Nakahara. "Maybe they do not hate us as much as we thought." The days at Camp McCoy fell into a strange rhythm, neither entirely military nor fully civilian. Dawn arrived slowly over the Wisconsin hills, shrouding the wooden barracks in a pale mist. Japanese prisoners, once soldiers trained to die for the emperor, now rose before sunrise to line up for inspection. Names were called, numbers recited, and every man answered in silence, their voices soft but steady. Lieutenant Takahashi moved among his men with the same care he had shown on the battlefield. Yet the stakes had shifted from survival in combat to understanding survival in captivity. Each morning, work assignments were distributed. Some swept the pathways, cleaned the barracks, or repaired fences. Others, under guard, were sent to nearby farms to help harvest potatoes and beets. For labor, they received camp tokens, small cardboard coins exchangeable for soap, stationery, or the occasional chocolate bar. The concept of being compensated by the enemy was bewildering, yet gradually, the men accepted it as a peculiar form of fairness. Meals continued with regularity, each one a lesson in kindness that defied their indoctrination. Mashed potatoes, meatloaf, green beans, bread, butter, and sometimes apple pie. Every bite challenged the beliefs they had carried for years, that the Americans were merciless monsters, that mercy was weakness. Nakahara, once gaunt and hollow-eyed, now found himself savoring the flavor of food without fear, yet each mouthful carried the weight of disbelief. Lieutenant Takahashi observed quietly as men whispered to one another, comparing these foreign meals to memories of home. "We do not deserve this," one soldier muttered, eyes downcast. Takahashi replied softly, "They could starve us, yet they feed us. Perhaps they are not mocking." The young men nodded, silent, the lesson sinking slowly. In the evenings, the barracks echoed with small moments of life. Music drifted faintly from the guardhouse. American jazz, swing tunes, and violins played with a carefree energy that the prisoners could not comprehend. Takahashi would sit on his bunk, listening through the thin wooden walls. He did not understand the language of the songs, but he understood their message. Freedom had a sound, and it was gentle, persistent, and unthreatening. Meanwhile, letters from home began arriving, delivered through the International Red Cross. Some men wept openly as they read the words of mothers and wives who had assumed them dead. Others, trembling, could not bear to read it all. Nakahara received a brief note from his older brother in Osaka. "We are alive. Father's health is weak. Do not shame us by forgetting who you are." The simple words haunted him. Shame, he realized, had become a second skin. Yet when he thought of the warm meals, the steady routines, and the simple kindness of strangers, another emotion, gratitude, began to grow in its place. Life at Camp McCoy taught lessons that no combat manual could convey. Guards, once feared as instruments of death, were slowly understood as human beings. They smiled briefly, handed extra coffee or bread, and shared stories of families and home. Nakahara and Takahashi began to question their assumptions about honor and humanity. Survival, once measured by bullets and bravery, now depended on observing, learning, and absorbing the quiet power of mercy. Even the most rigid prisoners, those clinging desperately to the old codes of loyalty, found themselves lining up for meals, helping in the barracks, and accepting small gestures of kindness. By the third week, the rhythm of Camp McCoy had taken hold. The fences and barbed wire no longer felt solely like imprisonment. They marked a place where life continued, however strange, and where the enemy's power was tempered by compassion. Years later, Nakahara and Takahashi met again in Tokyo, sitting in a small tea house near the river. Both older, their faces weathered, they spoke of families, peace, and of the camp that had once held them captive. "I still remember that first meal," Nakahara said quietly. "It changed me. It made me see them not as monsters, but as people." Takahashi smiled faintly. "Yes," he replied. "That meal was the first time I felt free, even behind a fence." They sat in silence, listening to the soft rustle of the river outside, carrying a peace that had survived the war. The story of the Japanese prisoners, the fear, the tears, the astonishment at mercy, remained a small, almost forgotten thread in the vast tapestry of World War II. Yet within it lived proof that humanity can exist even in captivity, that kindness can undo years of hate, and that mercy does not make a man weak, it makes him human.